Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. This evening we'll be going through the second of the 4 parts of the Satipatthana. So we'll start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll begin going through the Pali text of this portion of the sutta and discussing its meaning. And then afterwards I'll take any questions that you have, so feel free to type in questions at any time. So we can start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So a while back we had done a in-depth study of the first part of the Satipatthana Sutta, the section on Kayanupassana, so investigation of the body, contemplation of the body. And the link to that Dhamma talk is in the comments. So later on, if you want to go back and check out that part, you're welcome to. Advance warning, it's quite long. It's about 2 hours long. So if you like Dhamma, then that's 2 hours of joy. If you have a short attention span, that's probably about 1 hour and 45 minutes too long. So you might need to do it in multiple installments. But nonetheless, it's there if you're interested in going into part 1. Today we'll be looking at the second Satipatthana, which is much shorter, so we won't be here for 2 hours probably. The second one is Vedananupassana, which is the investigation or contemplation of Vedana. So before talking about this, we should talk about what Vedana means. So Vedana, it actually comes from the root vid, which just means to know or to understand or to seek for. So it's the same root from which we get the word vidya, which means knowledge. But in the context of Vedana, this root has the sense of just knowing something in the very direct sense of sensation. So Vedana is sometimes translated as feeling tone, which is reasonable as we start getting into this paragraph. You'll see why it's sometimes translated that way. Sometimes it's translated as sensation, but most commonly it's translated as feeling. And when we say feeling, it's important to clarify that Vedana does not mean emotion. So emotion is in the third Satipatthana, which we'll get to tomorrow. Whereas Vedana is not dealing with emotion, but rather it's dealing with the more fundamental, basic aspect of any sensation. So also when we use the word sensation, often when we think about sensations, we think about the information conveyed by those sensations. For example, if you look at a red mat, then you're thinking it's red and it's a mat. So the information that you're getting through that sensation. But when we talk about Vedana, we're talking about something much more basic. So most commonly in the suttas, the Buddha, when he says Vedana, he talks about 3 kinds of Vedana. Sukha Vedana, which means pleasant sensation, pleasant experience. Dukkha Vedana, unpleasant experience, painful experience. And Adukkama Sukha Vedana. So Vedana, which is neither painful nor pleasant, neutral sensation. And actually, Vedana could also be translated as experience or experiencing in this very simple way of how we experience a sensation. In this particular part of the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha gives a slightly more detailed layout of Vedana. So we can go ahead and start looking at the discourse. So the first line here, the Buddha says, Katanchapana bhikkhave bhikkhu vedanasu vedananupassi viharati. So katang means how, or in what way. So how does bhikkhu, so in this case, bhikkhu is a stand-in for any monastic. So this, by the way, is an interesting point, which does need to be kept in mind when reading the suttas. So in Pali, as in many gendered languages, including such modern languages as Italian and Spanish and so on, in Pali, whenever referring to a mixed gender group, one always uses the masculine form. So in the suttas, whenever the Buddha is talking to a group of people and he says bhikkhus, there may have been both bhikkhus and bhikkhunis present. We don't know. Because in Pali, you always default to the masculine whenever referring to either a mixed group or an unknown group, a group of unknown composition. So he says, so how does a bhikkhu dwell? Vedanasu Vedananupassana. So anupassi means to see clearly, or to understand, or to comprehend. So it's from the verb pasati, which means to see or to look at. So anupassi means to look at deeply or thoroughly. So how does one thoroughly or deeply observe Vedana? And as with the other Satipatthanas, here the Buddha is repeating the word Vedana. So Vedanasu is the locative form. So in Vedana, or in terms of Vedana, or in relation to Vedana. So the emphasis here, once again, is to look at the core experience itself. So we're not looking at a mental concept of the experience, but rather we're trying to directly observe the experience itself. So this is a running theme throughout Satipatthana, is that we're trying to drop our concepts and ideas about reality and come into direct contact with reality itself. So this is how we come to understand what's going on. So this first line, Katanchapana bhikkhave bhikkhu vedanasu vedananupassi viharati. How does one practice? Deeply, profoundly observing Vedana. And the Buddha says, Ida bhikkhave bhikkhu sukhang va vedanang vediyamano, sukhang vedanang vediyami iti pajanati. So he says here, when one is experiencing a pleasant sensation, so sukha vedana, and he says, well, then one understands, I am experiencing a pleasant vedana, a pleasant experience. So this is the most basic level. It's understanding, recognizing that a pleasant sensation is happening. Similarly, the next one, dukkang va vedanang vediyamano, dukkang vedanang vediyami iti pajanati. Similarly, when experiencing a painful sensation, a painful experience, one recognizes that it's painful, it's uncomfortable. And the third one as well, when experiencing adukkama sukhang vedanang, so this neither painful nor pleasant vedana, neutral sensation, neutral feeling, then one knows that that's what it is. It's a neutral feeling. So as mentioned, the Buddha starts with going through the three standard ways of analyzing sensation or Vedana, pleasant, painful, and neutral. So the most basic level of doing Vedananupassana, so mindfulness of feeling, is just to know whenever we're experiencing any kind of sensation, to know whether we're experiencing it as pleasant, painful, or neutral. Next, the Buddha says, Samisang va sukhang vedanang vedimano, samisang sukhang vedanang vediyami iti pajanati. So samisa, so this is from the word amisa, which literally means flesh or meat. So samisa means fleshy, physical, something related to our direct physical experience. So when experiencing a physical sensation that is pleasant, so a samisa, physical, a meaty, fleshy sensation, Vedana, which is pleasant, sukha, then one understands that that's what it is. One understands this is a physical experience, a pleasant physical experience. Then the next one, niramisang vasukang vedanang vedyamano, niramisang sukhang vedanang vedyami iti pajanati. So niramisa, again from the same word amisa, flesh. The prefix nir means not or without. So niramisa means a non-physical experience, a non-fleshy, non-corporeal experience. So this would be Vedana, which is related to mental objects, for example. So when a memory appears, that memory may produce a pleasant reaction or a painful reaction or a neutral reaction. None of that has anything to do with the body. It's all occurring in the mind. So that we would call niramisa. It's not connected with anything fleshy. It's not connected with the body in any way. And this can get a little bit blurry because then we can also then have a visceral response to a mental object. So there can be this kind of chain reaction which then occurs. But if we're paying close attention, then you can watch every step. You can watch, okay, first there's the arising of the mental object. In this example, a memory. That mental object is then perceived as pleasant, painful, or neutral. So let's say in this case, maybe it's a painful memory. So we're perceiving a painful sensation in the mind. And then we have a visceral reaction in the body. So a physical sensation appears, which might also be painful. So you can recognize this process unfolding, and you can identify each distinct part of it. Normally, when we're not paying particularly close attention, it's hard to separate these different components, and it just comes all jumbled together. So a memory appears in the mind, and it seems like just immediately our stomach is churning and our heart's beating fast, and we're feeling uncomfortable. And we may not recognize the process that's happening here. We may not recognize the causal sequence, and we may not recognize the individual components of the experience. But as we develop a much sharper, more refined attention, then it becomes possible to separate out these components of experience. So again, with the sequence going on, then the Buddha says, Sami sangva dukkang vedanang, so painful physical experience. Niramisang dukkang vedanang, so a painful non-physical experience. And then also again, for both of them, adukkama sukhang, so the neutral physical experience and neutral non-physical experience. So this is not that much more complex than, again, the way we normally talk about Vedana. But here the Buddha is emphasizing to make a clear distinction between physical sensation and mental sensation. So as well as making a clear distinction between pleasant, painful, and neutral sensation, to also clearly distinguish physical sensation and mental sensation. And that's also a deeper point here. So normally as we go through life, then we tend to ignore neutral sensation. Actually, for the most part, we just don't pay any attention to neutral Vedana because it's not particularly interesting if we don't take a deliberate interest in it. And also often when experiencing painful Vedana, we try to ignore it, or we try to distract ourselves from it, or we try to find something else to do with the mind so that we don't have to confront that sensation. But here the Buddha is emphasizing that all 6 kinds of sensation, so pleasant, painful, neutral, whether physical or mental, so for a total of 6, all 6 of them should be given full attention to when they arise. We should be willing to confront them directly and understand them completely. And when we do understand them completely, we can also recognize that the reaction of desire, aversion, and ignorance, which is the tendencies in regard to pleasant Vedana, painful Vedana, neutral Vedana, respectively, that these reactions are unnecessary. They're additions that we add onto the experience. They're not automatic. So through this courageous willingness to directly feel whatever kind of Vedana is passing through the mind and to discern its nature, then it's possible to have this deeper level of equanimity, this equanimity which clearly knows but is not swept away into reactivity of any sort. So this actually is the secret. So if people sometimes ask, what's the secret to doing long periods of sitting meditation? Well, actually, the secret is being willing to feel pain, being willing to directly confront any kind of sensation without reacting to it. So it's practice of mindfulness and equanimity. Then the Buddha then concludes this section with the what we call the refrain. So the way that he ends every section of the Satipatthana Sutta, he gives this basic overview of how to practice with any section of the Satipatthana Sutta. So then he says, Itiyaja tangva vedanasu vedananupassana viharati. So he says, in this way, one practices observing feelings internally. So ajatang literally means within yourself. But normally we translate this word internally. Bahidda va vedanasu vedananupassana viharati. So bahidda means externally. And then ajata bahidda va vedanasu vedananupassana viharati. So both internally and externally. And there's a fair amount of debate about what the Buddha means when he talks about internal and external, particularly in relationship to feeling. So internal meaning one's own feeling, and external meaning the feelings of others is one way that this is sometimes interpreted. That's a little bit difficult for me to accept, since knowing the feelings of others would seem to require that one have telepathic abilities, which is relatively uncommon. So as a practice which is accessible to everyone, I'm not quite sure that's what the Buddha was talking about. Another way I've heard this spoken about in terms of the contemplation of the body is internal meaning within the body and external meaning the outer surface of the body. Again, I find that a little bit hard to take on completely. Rather, I think that most likely what's going on here is the point that one is not leaving anything out. So one is not defining a particular zone and saying, well, I'm only going to be aware of sensations within one particular zone. So I don't think it's actually necessary to go into detail in describing what is internal and what is external. But rather, the point here is that the Buddha is saying that we pay full attention to both internal and external. So if we are inclined to draw boundaries and say, well, I'm only paying attention within this area and not paying attention outside of this area, well, the Buddha is encouraging us to drop that boundary and recognize a limitless domain of attention. So wherever Vedana appears within the domain of our awareness, then we are aware of it. We pay attention to it. And if you do have the ability to feel other people's minds, then that would also seem to fit within this particular domain of mindfulness. Then the next instruction he gives, and this is very important, this is one of the critical parts of the Satipatthana Sutta. The Buddha says, Samudaya Dhamma Nupassiva Vedanasu Viharati. So Samudaya Dhamma Nupassi. So again, anupassi means observing. deeply or profoundly. And samudaya dhamma. Samudaya means arising, so coming into being. And dhamma here has the meaning of nature or characteristic. So samudaya dhamma means the nature of coming into being, the arising of something, the appearing of something. And vaya dhamma nupassiva vedanasiva harati, this is the next one. Vaya dhamma means the nature of disappearing. So vaya means to move away, to go away. So vaya dhamma means the nature of disappearing. And samudaya vaya dhamma nupassiva vedanasiva harati. So samudaya vaya dhamma is the nature of both arising and disappearing. So here the Buddha is saying that in regards to Vedana, so in regards to any feeling or sensation that's happening, whether it's pleasant, painful, or neutral, whether it's physical or non-physical, we should observe its nature of arising, so its tendency to come into being, and its nature of ceasing, of disappearing, of fading away, vanishing from experience. And also that you can observe these simultaneously. So the third statement here, samudaya vaya dhamma nupassiva vedanasiva harati, one can observe both the arising and ceasing of Vedana. So this is talking about the perception of impermanence, the recognition of anicca, of the constant change, the lack of persistent substance to anything whatsoever within experience. So also with Vedana, as with every other aspect of Satipatthana, the Buddha is stating that we should observe its impermanence. We should observe its arising and ceasing, which can be directly felt as an ongoing moment-by-moment experience. And practicing in this way, once again, it becomes possible to have a mind of perfect equanimity, a mind of perfect serenity. When we see that things are constantly arising and ceasing, then we don't attach to whatever appears because we know it's about to disappear. We don't react with negativity because we know it's about to disappear. So the mind also doesn't identify as anything because it knows it's disappearing. Like there's nothing here which can be held onto. There's nothing here which can be settled upon. Which the Buddha makes a statement to that effect a bit later in this paragraph, but we'll get to that in just a moment. So the next thing he says is atti vedanati va panasa sati pachupatita hoti. So atti vedana means there are vedanas, so there are feelings, there are sensations. Va panasa sati pachupatita hoti. So pachupatita means well established. So he says there can just be mindfulness well established that there are Vedana. So the Buddha here is also saying that it's also possible just to stay with the clear, direct awareness of Vedana. So one doesn't necessarily need to go into this analytical division that he's been talking about thus far. So the division of the 6 kinds of feeling, internal and external, arising and ceasing. But also a very simple way of practicing Satipatthana is just to be aware of Vedana, aware of the experience of feeling. And he says, Yavadeva jnana mattaya padissati mattaya, which means to have mindfulness established to the extent necessary to have knowledge and attention. So again, this is kind of a baseline level of awareness without necessarily doing anything in particular, not cultivating any particular perception or contemplation, but just staying at the level of knowing what's happening. And then the Buddha makes the statement, anisito chaviharati. This is a very important statement. So here he's describing the kind of mind state that we're trying to develop through practicing Satipatthana. So anisito means not dependent. So the word nisita literally means leaning against. So anisita means we're not leaning against anything. We're not relying upon anything. So anisita is often translated as independent, but it should be understood as meaning that one is not relying upon anything. One is not settling on anything. One is not dwelling on anything. Actually, one of the literal meanings of nisita is a dwelling. So something that you settle on. So anisita means one is not settled on anything. One is not dwelling on anything. And this is because when one clearly observes the arising and disappearing of phenomena, one recognizes that there's nothing solid to dwell upon in the first place. So you just let it flow through the mind. And then he says, Nachikinchi loke upadiyati. And he says, and nothing whatsoever in the world is clung to. So one doesn't have upadana. So one isn't grasping at anything in the world. So upadiyati is the present tense passive form of the verb, same verb from which we get upadana. So upadana is grasping or clinging or holding on or trying to latch on to something. So he's saying, the Buddha is saying when one practices in this way, then one is practicing to not grasp at anything in the world, anything within the domain of our experience. And he concludes the paragraph with, Evam piko bhikkhave bhikkhu vedanasu Vedananupassana harati. Says, in this way, one practices observing Vedana in Vedana, so observing the process of feeling or sensation. So that's the end of this Satipatthana. So, as mentioned, much shorter than the first Satipatthana. The first one took 2 hours. This one took less than 30 minutes, so it was much briefer. And so we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And if there's any questions, I can take questions at this time. So first off, hello to the people joining in online. So hello to Maria, Vivian, John, Yankee, Amaranta, and all the others joining in. And if you have a question, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess the first one is, in doing this meditation, often having awareness just of sensation almost brings, I don't want to say a pleasant feeling, but like there's almost a pleasantness. There's a state, and I don't know if that's more going to that, talking about equanimity, it seems like a peacefulness. Just knowing, even if it's quote unquote an unpleasant sensation that's rising, when awareness is there, it brings, even with that unpleasant, like peaceful.
Yeah, so equanimity is a subtle form of pleasantness. So it's not sukha vedana per se, but it has a subtle pleasantness of its own. There's actually a discourse where there's 2 monks arguing, and one is saying, oh, the Buddha said there's 3 kinds of Vedana. And the other monk says, no, there's only 2 kinds of Vedana. And they go to the Buddha, and the Buddha says, well, actually, you're both right. And the reason why you're both right is because neutral sensation, when fully known, is a subtle form of pleasant sensation. So in that sense, you could say that it's a pleasant experience, pleasant sensation. Also, it's worth pointing out that nibbana, although nibbana itself has no sankharas and therefore has no sukha vedana, dukkha vedana, or adukkha sukha vedana, nonetheless, the Buddha says nibbana is the highest form of sukha. So nibbanam paramang sukham. So although there's no vedana, it can still be described as Nibbana can still be described as sukha.
Mm.
Okay.
Yes, that's very helpful.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And so, in looking at the links of dependent origination, I've always felt and thought with a human body, there's always sensations. Like there's always Vedana if I have a human body. But when that awareness comes, that replaces that feeling, that clinging, that comes in. Instead of clinging, it doesn't go to clinging, there's an awareness. Is that accurate, do you think?
Well, I mean, whenever we get into talking about paticca samuppada, it always becomes something long and complicated.
Yes.
But yeah, briefly speaking, one of the ways that many meditation teachers will apply paticca samuppada to meditation practice is that by directly observing Vedana, then you can stop the mind from going into desire and attachment. So that stops the chain at that point. It stops it at the point of Vedana.
So,
yeah. And technically, you can actually stop it at one spot before that. This is more refined. So if you are paying close attention to the six senses, then you can recognize that the information itself is not pleasant, painful, or neutral. So this is actually quite a bit more difficult. You have to pay much, much sharper attention. So most teachers will say, well, after it's already developed into sukha, dukkha, adukkha, sukha, then you recognize, oh, this is sukha vedana, dukkha vedana, adukkha, sukha vedana, and you just stop right there. That's all it is. Yeah, the point of stopping at the six senses is more like the instructions in the Bahya Sutta. In the seen, there is just the seen. In the heard, there's just the heard, and so on. Okay?
Thank you, Father.
Yeah. And Anthony, hello, Anthony, says, in the Vedana section of Anapanasati, are piti and sukha considered non-physical feelings? Well, that's an interesting question. Well, I would say next time you're doing mindfulness of breathing, look at those Vedana and see whether it's physical or non-physical. So you might find that there's components of both. I personally usually relate to piti as more physical and sukha as more mental when we're talking about samadhi factors. But it's not necessarily so sharply divided. And Anthony also asks, how does chitta sankhara relate to Vedana? Well, chitta sankhara literally just means mental sankharas, so sankharas of mind. So how does it relate to Vedana? If we're talking about Vedana in terms of the 5 khandas, then Vedana is one thing and sankhara is another thing. So Vedana, again, is this very basic level of pleasant, painful, neutral. Whereas sankhara is the more complex stories and concepts and activities which we engage in with the mind. So thinking and planning and identifying and so on. So much more complex structures of mind. He also says, Venerable Sujato translates it as emotions. Translates Vedana as emotions? That is very peculiar. Unless you mean chitta sankhara as emotion, which is still peculiar. Yeah, I would not translate either word as emotion personally. I think that doesn't do justice to the Pali word. And Bhavani says, what is the purpose of knowing feelings? Well, as I mentioned before, through directly knowing every aspect of our experience, we can observe it with mindfulness and equanimity. We can observe it with the wisdom that recognizes impermanence, recognizes that this is insubstantial, it's impersonal, and therefore it's not something which we need to react to in a way that produces dukkha. So the purpose of knowing feelings is in order to interrupt our subconscious habits of self-torture, which is what we normally do. So we're actually constantly engaging in a low-level pattern of mental self-torture. Every now and then it kind of spikes into very unpleasant states of mind, but most of the time it's just this kind of relatively mild needling in the back of the mind. So through knowing feeling, you can start to recognize that process of subconscious mental self-torture and get it to diminish and eventually stop. Anthony clarifies, Chitta Sankara is what he translates as emotions. Yeah, I don't know why. So you would have to ask him why he chose to translate it that way. He might explain. I'm often a little bit baffled about the word choices that other translators sometimes make, but I'm sure they're often baffled by some of the word choices I make. So that's translation for you. We all try to pick words to describe things, but there's always knowing that certain words you can never really perfectly translate. I'm sure he has good reasons for translating it as emotions, but you'd have to ask him. I can't explain his choice on that one. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead.
Bhante, I've heard one of the highest attainments is the cessation of perception and feeling. But then I've heard that the Buddha was still capable of feeling pain, like when his foot got a sliver from the boulder that Devadatta threw at him. So I'm just confused about when the cessation of feeling is attained, what feelings are cease and which is he still capable of feeling until his body dissolves?
So the cessation of perception and feeling is a temporary experience. So it's a state of concentration. So it's not a permanent removal of all sensation for all eternity, but rather it's a temporary state of concentration which one can experience while still alive. So it's sometimes said to be the experience within samsara that is as close as one can get to experiencing nibbana. But it's not a permanent change of mind. So the Buddha, until his final passing away, the Buddha still had a body, and bodies produce sensations. So the Buddha was aware of the sensations produced by his body. The difference is that he wasn't bothered by any of it. He recognized that this is just bodies doing what bodies do. So he was aware of the sensations, but he wasn't upset by it. So, for example, there's one sutta where the Buddha says to Ananda, he says, my back is troubling me. I'm going to go and lie down for a while. So, and he tells Venerable Ananda to give a Dhamma talk. So the way I imagine this going is the Buddha saying this just perfectly calmly. So the same way you might say, like, it's 8 o'clock. The same way the Buddha was like, my back is causing trouble. I'm going to go lie down. Whereas the rest of us, it would be more like, my back, it hurts. God, I need to take a break. You take care of this. And the Buddha's just like, yeah, back's causing trouble. Yeah, I'm going to go lie down. So it's just this matter-of-fact acknowledgement that this is the nature of bodies. But the Buddha was not disturbed by these things. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
From a practical perspective, to practice this, would one bring the object of concentration into the foreground until there was enough concentration and have this parallel or background? Or
well, there's different ways of practicing with it. So this is one of the things that's simultaneously charming and frustrating about Buddhism is that the Buddha gave quite broad, open-ended frameworks for practice. And actually, this is infinite compassion, because it's recognizing that each person is going to have individual needs and will work well with different approaches. So my own approach is always based in a still mind. So I don't move my mind towards anything in particular, except on rare occasion. If something is really, really overwhelming, then I might turn and focus my mind on that for a while, just so I can understand what's going on. And that understanding then usually leads to it being less disturbing, or even not disturbing at all anymore. But usually, again, as I was speaking about earlier during the discussion at tea time, with keeping this like broad, open awareness, then that naturally includes everything that comes and goes. And anything that comes and goes, one will know it, but you don't need to turn your attention towards it in order to know it, because it's within that peripheral field of knowing. And within that peripheral field of knowing, you'll see things arising and ceasing. And you'll recognize that there's nothing there that's worth dwelling on. So as the Buddha said, anisito cha viharati, like there's nothing worth dwelling on. So you just let it come and go. Okay. And Amaranta asks, when we observe Vedana, is it before mental formations or is it after, when words appear to describe the sensations? I've been meditating and it's too quick, the transformation in words. Properly speaking, it's before. So Vedana is this very fundamental, basic, animalistic response. So the first is the direct sensory input. So seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and mental cognition. So the basic sensory input. Then there's an almost immediate reaction of pleasant, painful, or neutral. Then after that, then one gets into identifying what's going on. Then after that, we get into thinking about it. So again, in this case, so you're looking at a red cushion. Well, actually, the very first thing we experience is not red cushion. The very first thing we experience is direct sensory input through the eyes, which is much too fast to put words on. And then we have a reaction. So maybe if you don't like the color red, then you perceive it as dukkha vedana. Then we're like, well, what is it? Oh, it's a red cushion, and I don't like red cushions. And then we go into a story about why we don't like red cushions, which would be sankhara. So this is how things unfold. But yeah, it does happen extremely fast. So if you're not paying very close attention, and if you don't already have very strong samadhi, then usually we don't even notice the separate parts of the sequence. It just seems all simultaneous. It seems all mixed together and happening all at once. But as one's concentration becomes stronger and one's awareness becomes more sharply refined, then you can identify this causal sequence. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, maybe that's enough for one evening. So tomorrow we'll be starting the morning with Satipatthana section 3, mindfulness of mind. So until then, we can conclude the session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.